Thank you, Paula, for inviting me. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And for Laura to invite me for this year. I'm on sabbatical in my college, my university in the States. And I'm writing this book on activism using Bruno Latour and his philosophy to understand the power of art. So any feedback that you have on this, it's a work in progress, I would be very grateful for. Let me dive in. I apologize. It's kind of philosophical, the stuff I'm going to talk about. So having it written down is kind of important so I don't get lost or lose you. So I'll just, okay, so art is powerful. We often hear this said, but how much do we understand about art's power? Art is usually seen as powerful enough to make us feel something or think something. But what about those artworks that have changed the world, that started revolutions or stopped systematic injustice? How did they do it? There are neurological studies that have documented the changes in the brain after viewing certain artworks, and psychological studies that have shown how art influences emotion. And emotions can direct people to do dramatic things, but the exact mechanisms of how that happens have not been figured out. So some of these world-changing artworks don't even look very powerful at a glance. Take, for example, these photographs. These were part of a series of photos that managed to change the course of history, prompting JFK to declare an end to racial segregation in the South 1 month after they were published around the world. But how did a bunch of photographs that look very much like some children playing in a sprinkler on a hot day change the world? And I'll get back to these photos later. So today, many injustices in society are coming to the surface, together with the biggest existential crisis that the world has ever faced, global warming. Activism has never been more important as the only way to persuade people and governments to change their actions and remedy the social and environmental problems that are besetting the world. Unfortunately, after the US Patriot Act in 2001, and recently in the UK as well, tactics to occupy, disrupt, and protest have become difficult as they have become criminalized. They still work in France, though. I'm glad to see the land of revolution. So these are tactics that governments have discovered how to circumnavigate. The population also are less shocked and surprised or moved by them. When millions of people protest against the Iraq war, banking deregulation, women's rights and racism, and nothing happens, we have to ask ourselves, why are these methods not working? So one of the reasons is that the thing that moves people to change, according to the latest research, as it has for millennia, is emotion, not words, facts, or numbers of protesters. 1 month after 10 million people protested the Iraq war, George Bush still invaded Iraq. However, in 2005, when Cindy Sheehan, an American mother who lost her son in Iraq, protested for 4 weeks outside of Bush's vacation ranch in Texas, while he was on vacation, she single-handedly helped swing a much larger proportion of American public opinion against the Iraq war. As this illustrates, particular artworks and performances have enormous power. Leo Tolstoy wrote, "Art can compel people freely, gladly, and spontaneously to sacrifice themselves in the service of man." We usually attribute this power to emotion, because images, artworks, creative actions, and performances are able to stimulate emotion. We believe that emotion is the means through which art is powerful. But it is much more complicated than this. There's an unknown connection between when a person sees an artwork and changes their attitude or behavior, or takes a dramatic action on an issue. What happens when people see an artwork and then sacrifice themselves for it? In a major funded project by the Center for Artistic Activism, Steve Duncombe reviewed extensive literature on the agency of art and interviewed 60 eminent artistic activists for their theories of how art is powerful. In conclusion, unfortunately, he wrote that despite tens of thousands of years of art practice and thousands of years of philosophical discussion and art criticism and brain studies of neurological effects of exposure to art, the power of art is beyond rational explanation. Nevertheless, if activism wishes to effectively change people and influence governments, it would be a good idea to figure out the mechanisms by which art is powerful. Art history might have an especially important part to play in activism, because only art historians have the ability to investigate how art is so powerful. By studying the process behind the creation of successful artworks in the past, their context and detailed circumstances, we can see how these artworks became powerful and thus how to create new ones. Without examining this process, artists do not have guidance to create further powerful artworks. In addition, the traditional guidance given to artists has prevented them from being powerful. Artists have not been helped by the traditional perception of art as non-instrumentalist, the idea that art should not be useful or used for politics, but should be separate and above society and politics, according to Hans Hake and Susie Gablik. In the past 200 years, art has been presented as a form of self-examination and reflection, art for art's sake. John Pitman Weber. In the presentation of artists as geniuses who alienate themselves from society, art history has also helped artists to believe that they should alienate themselves too. According to Stephen Duncombe, as a result, many activist artworks are politically expressive artworks rather than activist art. They are placed in galleries or on Instagram, expressing the artist's feelings about social injustices, but have less impact on the issues. Much of this expressionism stems from anger, sadness, or helplessness, a way to vent rage rather than stemming from a campaign. While political expressionism is a worthy form of art with an illustrious history, it should not be confused with artistic activism that attempts to change opinions. As Lucy Lippard writes, quote, "Political art tends to be socially concerned, and activist art tends to be socially involved. However, when artists have been embedded in campaigns, or when activists have found their own creative side, some of the artworks and creative actions that have emerged have been explosive, causing a tipping point in campaigns that have changed the face of history. It's by understanding these instances and how they were so powerful that we can learn what it is that makes art powerful. In order to study how these artworks are powerful, for a book on the art of activism, I've applied the philosophy and methodology of Bruno Latour to study about 200 artworks and found that his concepts are very applicable to the understanding of art's power. His method could also provide an interesting method for investigating other artworks in art history. As you probably know, Bruno Latour is a French philosopher and anthropologist of science who has made an outsized contribution to a number of disciplines across the world. He's best known for his erosion of the subjective-objective division and his understanding of the power of objects. Recently, Latour focused on activist solutions to environmental problems, but I wish to use his earlier philosophy to create a methodology for all activism. Work in progress. So, before we explore what makes art a powerful force for change, it's important to know why artists have not seen art as instrumentalist and a force for change. Latour argues in his book, We Have Never Been Modern, that objects are not generally seen to be powerful enough to change actions or stimulate violence. This is because of a problem at the foundation of Western philosophy, the separation of nature from culture. Latour writes that the divide emerged because of the Faustian bargain that scientists had to make to practice science. In order to avoid being accused of using political or religious bias in their experiments, scientists had to view the objects they were experimenting on as purely natural and void of any religious or social significance. This resulted in a distinct separation of scientific disciplines from the humanities and arts. And it began the education of the populace that natural things were purely natural and cultural or social things were purely cultural. Subsequently, aspects of society such as art and religion were seen as purely cultural, with no relation to nature. Now, prior to the 1660s, most people did not distinctly separate nature, religion, science, astronomy, art, and society. Each were integrated in various ways with each other. People were happy to use religious explanations for science, but they were also much more careful about not disrupting the natural order of things because it was seen as important for maintaining the social order, and vice versa. This fear of disrupting the natural and social order is largely what prevented radical changes to nature and society from happening over thousands of years of human civilization. However, once the world was divided into natural and cultural things with no relation to one another, major changes to society and nature could proceed, allowing for the Industrial Revolution and rapid social changes. It also led to the subsequent destruction of the natural world, since it was no longer believed that the exploitation of nature could have any consequences for society. Now, Latour argues that many solutions, from semiotics to phenomenology, have been sought to mend this divide between nature and culture. But each have ended up eventually perpetuating the divide. Apart from environmental devastation, this separation also gave us a strange way of thinking about art. It prevented us from understanding art's power. Now, in a project named the Image Wars in 2001, designed to investigate the power of art and images, Bruno Latour, together with Peter Wiebel, assembled more than 100 artists, philosophers, theologians, and writers to ask why artworks and images cause violent actions. In the resulting 700-page tome, Iconoclash, Beyond the Image Wars in Science, Religion, and Art, The participants cited several hundred examples, from the iconoclasm of the Puritans to the dynamiting of the Bamiyan Buddhas by the Taliban in Afghanistan. One of the most dramatic conclusions from the project was that Western philosophy does not explain why people get violent over art. Latour argued that Western philosophy has difficulty because it's derived from this separation of nature from culture. As a result, modernism and postmodernism see art objects, religious objects, or creative actions as purely human expressions, rather than representatives of networks of natural and human relationships. Once art is separated from the world, it's difficult for people to see art as having any power to influence the world or people's actions. As a result, art is often seen to be ornamental and symbolic, only with meaning in relation to other symbols in a cultural system of meaning, from Bourdieu. It's because of this lack of a connection between art and reality that artists have traditionally been educated that art is not instrumentalist. It's believed that art can raise awareness, but it doesn't change the world. That it makes people feel something, but not do anything, because we've separated culture from actual reality. But it's clear from Latour's project, The Image Wars, that many objects throughout history have led to violent acts and rapid change. In recognition of this empirical fact, artists and activists have begun to cooperate, and courses on artistic activism have begun to be offered at universities. However, this is a very recent phenomenon, and there is little change in how art and art history theorize about the power of art. The only mention, most books on activism still have little or no mention of art as a valuable tactic. The only mention of art in the activist compendium, Beautiful Trouble, is that art seeks to explore the deep questions. Politics demands a clear direction and message. End quote. Such a reductive view of art is a result of our separation of nature from culture, and is the reason artists and activists rarely comprehend the full power of art. This is very different from the view of art in indigenous societies. In many non-modern societies, art is seen as very powerful, not so much a symbol than an explanation of nature, a way to understand, control, remember, and predict natural and social phenomena. In most indigenous societies that have little Western contact, there's no word for art. Artistic creations represent more of a science. Instead of being separate from nature, art is the result of a network of natural and human information and actions. Islamic philosopher and art historian Saeed Hossein Nazir writes that Islamic art's goal is to reflect natural reality in the world and surround people with a picture of this reality during their lives in order to remold them, bringing them into conformity with primordial nature. Thus, art is very much about reflecting nature in a highly scientific way, transforming the cosmos into an object which can be contemplated. Yet when non-modern or indigenous people argue that an object or artwork is powerful and has influenced them, they are dismissed as animists, as mistakenly believing that inanimate objects could have agency. Animism is a damning term in our culture because we've been taught that we should not confuse nature and culture, but separate them. That confusing them is superstitious. Ironically, however, Latour writes that indigenous people have a much better idea of how objects actually work than we do, because they do not make a separation between nature and culture. Now, in his book, Native Science, Chua Indian, Gregory Cogetti, writes that, quote, everything in nature has something to teach humans. This is the indigenous view of animism, end quote. Through a process of storytelling and rituals, natural objects and human-created artworks are given power by using them to explain how natural processes work and how people fit into that natural balance. Now, the way that such information and relationships are encrypted into artworks and objects is through narratives. Cogetti writes that, quote, stories are filled with analogies, characters, and representations drawn from nature. Metaphors that more often than not refer to the processes of nature from which they're drawn, or to human nature, which they attempt to reflect, end quote. Natural elements, forces, fluctuations, and human agencies are reduced to characters and legends and mythologies, including gods, animals, and people. These characters, or natural elements, then act out their relationships with each other to explain natural processes and phenomena in the world and humans' part in it. These stories are then reduced further into ceremonies, which encrypt objects or symbols with meaning that bring all the elements together to represent interrelationships between them. Then Cogetti writes, quote, through ceremony, indigenous artists pack a symbol with specific meaning and intent. Petroglyphs represent a clear exemplification of such a packing process, and thus, quote, have a power beyond their literal connotations. Once endowed with networks of information about natural forces, relationships between natural things, humans, and moral values, such objects become powerful guides and influencers, since they can describe, control, and predict phenomena that was reduced by them. As such, objects and artworks in indigenous societies are tremendously powerful as encryptions of natural as well as cultural relationships. The importance of encoding indigenous art with natural information should not be underestimated. Many indigenous people have lived for thousands of years in unforgiving climates, with crippling heat at the equator or deadly cold in the Arctic, and would not have survived a day without a sophisticated knowledge of their environments, heating and cooling mechanisms, food and water procurement, and engineering for transport, housing, and hunting. Thousands of years ago, the need to transmit this information from generation to generation led to the development of artworks that explain their environments, knowledge, and best practices. Not only does this explain animism, but it can also help explain activist artworks too. Now, interestingly, this process of encrypting objects with information is the same process that Latour identified after a 2-year anthropological study at the Nobel Prize-winning laboratory in California. His description of the scientific method, one that was ratified by the laboratory, was that the scientific process is essentially a process of reduction and combination of information. As vast amounts of information are produced by conducting tests on an object, that information must be reduced to symbols to enable a lot of information to be observed in a small space. The combination of symbols into a formula allows the scientists to reduce all the relationships between the object and the various other elements that were tested on it. The way that this information is encrypted into an object in science is through the scientific article. This must be structured with all these different elements arrayed in perfect order, each element of which must be relevant. The best scientific articles are written like a good story, a narrative with a general context, a setting, characters, human and non-human in this case, a conflict, assumptions, and a resolution, through which the new object is given meaning. In reassembling the social, Latour's definition of a good scientific report is one that deploys the largest number of mediating actors, human and non-human, in a network of relationships. Now, this process creates formulas or technologies that describe, control, and predict the relationships that were reduced to create them. Thus, in a similar way to indigenous science, this process creates objects that then have enormous power. Of course, the difference between modern and indigenous science is that modern science reduces much more information than indigenous science, and therefore is much more powerful. Now, in my study of successful activist artworks through time, effective activist artworks and creative actions are actually very similar to the objects that are produced by indigenous and modern science. Art can be seen as comprising numerous relationships in a network that led to their existence. This network includes specific historical events, places, materials, theories, people, cultural references, etc., all of which were necessary for the object's characterization. By reducing and combining heterogeneous information about the real-world situation, issues, opponents, target audience, strategy, objectives, psychology, as well as information about historical precedents, cultural forms, and styles, the more the better. Art becomes not so much a symbol than a force that can explain, control, and influence behavior. As with indigenous and modern science, these elements are synthesized into an object or artwork through a story. As we have seen, is the primary mechanism for assembling and communicating the meaning of an object. Story must be structured with all these different elements arrayed in perfect order, with each relevant to the plot. Like a novel, the story must contain a general context, a setting with a problem, characters, human and non-human, a conflict, assumptions, and a resolution, through which the resulting object is given meaning. As it can be seen, stories are central to our lives. We construct our reality through creating, interpreting, and contesting the stories around us. Walter Fisher suggests that we should not be called Homo sapiens, knowing person, but Homo narrans, storytelling person, because this is so foundational to our nature. Now, the best way to show you how multiple elements and information are reduced and combined in a story that creates a powerful artwork is through examples. Some of the best examples of activism have come from the civil rights movement in the southern United States. Now, in his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King wrote, quote, "Injustice must be exposed with all the tension its exposure creates, to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured," end quote. In the letter, he describes his cunning plan to expose injustice in the South. His problem was that most injustices to African Americans were invisible. people would just disappear in the night. Racism was structural and institutional and not obvious. Violence happened at night and in the alleyways. With one creative action, he managed to produce dozens of shocking images that exposed the racism and violence against African Americans. Images that were broadcast to newspapers around the world and brought millions of Americans and many other countries to the African American side and contributed to the Civil Rights Act signed by President Johnson the very next year. However, without creating a many-layered narrative and action comprising knowledge of so many factors, the action would not have been successful. His genius was to bring together all the knowledge of his target, the US government, his opposition, the Birmingham police force, his audience, the US and the world context, the Cold War, fast-moving political and social affairs, and reporters and psychological and logistical factors. To create a few photographs, he and his lieutenants had to use their knowledge of all these factors to stage the entire operation while allowing the press to think it was an accident. Now, King understood the media and its need for an authentic story, and thus created a narrative for the newspapers to accompany their images. This used all the key elements of a story: context, setting, characters, conflict, solutions, and assumptions. Context was that the US was in the Cold War with the Soviet Union and was fashioning itself as the land of freedom and equality. King's objective was to expose the hypocrisy of this notion and force the government to put their money where their mouth was and prove it. King then searched for a good setting. A year earlier, the SCLC planned the desegregation of a city in Georgia, but it was a miserable failure because the sheriff arrested people quietly, put them in jail all over Georgia, and let them out 5 days after the press had left. So after that failure, King and his lieutenants looked around and picked out Birmingham, Alabama, which had a long history of virulent racism. He also knew the power of using children to gain sympathy. Using 3,000 children as the protesters or characters in the story would make it far more effective. However, there were many who disagreed with using children and going into a situation they knew would be dangerous. So King used the example of the Children's Crusade from medieval times as a historical precedent and a narrative for the action. Thirdly, King knew that the story needed a villain who represented the larger racist South. Part of the reason he settled on Birmingham was because he knew the Birmingham Commissioner of Public Safety, Theophilus Eugene Bull Connor. Connor was an open bigot and a member of the KKK, known for brutal policing methods. King knew that Connor would overreact in front of the media and call in the police and fire department, not just quietly arrest him. Connor had also just been voted out of office and had a couple more months of his job, so he had nothing to lose if he overreacted, because he didn't have to win another election. The plan was to create a conflict by the children marching into Birmingham using non-violent tactics to desegregate it. When they marched into Birmingham, sure enough, Connor overreacted, arresting thousands of children and using police dogs, batons, and the fire department, which turned hoses on people in front of the press. Martin Luther King set up the march in a way that he knew would result in scenes of chaos. But without it, reporters would not have been able to photograph and film scenes of authentic racist violence and expose the invisible racist assumptions of white supremacists. The publication in 1963 of these pictures of violence against African Americans in newspapers around the world finally showed what was going on in the South. Showed that the United States, which said it was so free, wasn't that free at all. These photographs had the immediate effect of forcing President J.F. Kennedy to condemn segregation and moved legislation in Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act 1 year later in 1964. By creating an event which told a vivid story of the wider racism inherent in American society, and then creating authentic photographs that encapsulated that narrative, King was able to overturn centuries of racist segregation in the South. These photographs would not have meant anything without the narrative, and were given power and meaning through being densely layered with real-world information, ideology, psychology, history, culture, and politics. Finally, I want to show you the power of paintings. The Black Power movement was partly connected with the Civil Rights Movement, but formed a separate identity and strategy for the northern United States. It formed, because the problem there was desegregation. It was not desegregation, but poverty, unemployment, police brutality, poor schools, and little health care. As a result of these conditions, most African Americans had the posture of the downtrodden and hopeless. Now, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was started by Huey Newton and actor Bobby Seale in Oakland, who believed that African Americans should take pride in their history and culture. The Black Panthers were heavily invested in street theater, using guns and military uniforms to give African Americans an image of strength. Leroy Jones, a Black Power poet and playwright, also created new gestures, gaits, clothing, and a language that helped create a respect for Black culture, which he trained others to perform on street corners. The Black Panthers sought to highlight the injustices, provide food for children, and protection against police brutality for neighborhoods. Now, 3 months after it started, Emory Douglas, a graphic designer, joined as the Minister of Culture to produce artwork for the newspaper, The Black Panther, a newspaper that went on to have a circulation of 300,000 copies a week. This newspaper created the narrative for the artworks, expressing the ideology of the Black Panthers, the issues facing African Americans, the revolutionary activities of the Black Panthers to fight and solve problems, and their connection to anti-colonial revolutions around the world. All the elements of a good narrative. The newspaper was the main tool used to shape Black culture, a culture that still exists today. And Douglas was a large part of this shaping process. He depicted the new confident warriors with military clothes, pride, new gestures, and hairstyles that expressed the narrative. In this image, the most powerful of many that he produced for the newspaper, and which was later mass-produced as a poster, he depicts the party's incendiary style, the central place of women in the movement, and the proud and defiant posture, clothes, hair, and military accessories of the new Black culture. Its connection to international conflicts and ideology, using the bold sans serif text, the African spear, Cuban poster graphics, the avant-garde Soviet style, and Mao Zedong's Chinese sunrise in bright colors gives it a shocking revolutionary punch. Remember that this is during the Cold War, when communism was feared in the US. With a towering figure bursting towards us, there's an urgency and rage depicted that is rarely seen in US posters. This encoded into the poster the psychology of shock and surprise, which the Black Panthers used to get past the filters of the public and make people sit up and think. The fact that it represents actual Black Panthers who are engaged in real actions against real inequalities that are outlined in the newspaper gives it a raw authenticity. Now, this poster helped inspire millions of Black men and women to join, dress, stand, and hope more confidently, and for the Black Panther ideas to spread through the visualization of everything that was printed in the newspaper. It helped spread the equality of the sexes, that women were equally welcome in leadership roles in the Black Panthers. It showed what revolution should look like, and questioned the US propaganda against communism. The connection with the psychedelic movement connected the Black Panthers with white supporters for civil rights. We began to see the Black Power movement as cool as well. The poster was then purchased and displayed on walls by millions of people, both white and Black, which inspired a generation. Most of these layers of meaning are obvious to art historians. However, it has been less clear how these layers make an artwork powerful and how they're layered into the artwork through a narrative, in this case outlined by the newspaper it was published in. So, in conclusion, once we realize that the power of artworks is not in the objects themselves, but in the multiple layers of knowledge that is encrypted into them through narratives, real world knowledge about the context, injustices, psychological, sociological, and political positioning encrypted into artworks, we get a better sense of how artworks are powerful. This requires a review of multiple dimensions using a multidisciplinary approach. So the interesting question is, could this be a useful approach for understanding how artworks are powerful in general? And I'll leave it there.